have kids down here, so they're obviously enjoying
Right.
Lent, with them.
Right.
So let me just see what time. Okay, it's 3:00. So without further ado, so let me begin, and whoever hopefully can, join us will do so. Now, Shalom, of course, last week was concentrating mostly about the Jews of Portugal and what happened to them. But I'm going to backtrack because I want to just review those last 100 years of Spanish Jewry while they, still were remaining, in Spain, and then to discuss certain key events, and what led up ultimately to the expulsion. So we always talk about the watershed moment, when there's a transition. Already Jews are sometimes have been forced to convert to Christianity, but those riots that occurred in the year 1391, so this is now a full almost 100 years prior to their actual expulsion. So this is that key event, and boy, everything just goes kind of downhill, after that. So we talked, I had actually read to you an excerpt from Rabbi Chistai Kreskas, what his recounting of how those horrible days were in Spain, and how so many Jewish communities throughout Castile and Aragon were just utterly devastated, and Jews were murdered, and to utter destruction. And the Jews of Spain, of course, never will recover from these horrible outbursts against them, again, with so much a loss of life and property. And of course, and the great tragic thing for us as Jews in this day is, probably close to half of them actually converted to Christianity. Now, again, these were sort of forced conversions. I mean, if somebody, a marauding mob is coming at you, and about to break down your door and kill you unless you convert. So, I don't know, what would we do if we were in that situation? You have families, children, older people you want to save, we'd like to think it would be so noble and Al Kiddush Hashem, we would give up our lives, but it's a very, very hard decision. And of course, as we know, quite a number of them, not all, but obviously a fairly large number of them were converting outwardly, but obviously secretly, to the best of their ability, we're still trying to practice Judaism. Not an easy task at all. So it starts again in 1391, again with these mob attacks all over Spain. Obviously, the government is not stopping it. And obviously, it was an unleashing of a lot of anger and animosity that had been building against the Jews, over a period of, let's say, 200 years, and then finally just burst out and just this riotous fashion. Obviously, eventually things quiet down, but then we discussed also, well, this would be 2 weeks ago, how then there was this disputation in the city of Tortosa. I told you Tortosa is south of Barcelona, a distance south of Barcelona. And there was this great disputation that was called for there between, the Christian forces as opposed to the Jewish forces. It lasted for like a year and a half. There were like 69 of these meetings, where these Jews were forced to defend their faith, and obviously it was already, so to speak, decided in advance. And of course, the Christians are going to be judged, as the ones with the best arguments, and then proven that Christianity. A lot of the attacks, as remember, just think about those original disputations that took place in Paris, where that Rabbi Yechiel had to defend, with many other Rabbonim, had to defend the Jewish faith. The attacks are on the Talmud. And I think the reason is they can't attack the Torah per se, because after all, Christians also, so to speak, maybe they obviously don't, they don't follow all the mitzvot, but they accept the old, what they call the Old Testament, it's not old to us, as part of their scriptures. So they certainly can attack whatever is being written about in, they might dispute an interpretation, but they cannot attack, that the Torah, or that Old Testament, the Tanakh, as being heretical, but that somehow that would reflect badly on their faith. So what they are attacking is the Talmud, which of course is our original basic work of the Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral Jewish law. And I can assure you that in the Gemara, there was a very minute discussion of Christianity. Has nothing to do with, the bulk of it, but, that they were picking things out of there. And that's why in Paris, how, all those cartloads of Gemaras were burned, right? Publicly in the square in Paris. And again, these are all accusations against the Talmud, that it is somehow taking the purity of the scriptures and turning it around, and it's all the rabbis' interpretation. They're the ones to blame. So following this, so what I want to do now, just going to take a little break. So I do want to tell you about some of the great Rabbonim from this time period. So I already talked to you about this Rabbi Chisdas Kreskas, right? He's the one, again, who wrote this personal account. I remember his only son was murdered during those riots of 1391. He describes that he was a bridegroom, and I read in one source he was only a 20-year-old boy. The Ron, who from the previous generation, one of his sons was also murdered. I thought it was very, very moving account of what occurred at those times. So I thought I would just, I'm going to backtrack to talk about one particular Rav, and then I'm going to go to Rabbi Chisdas Kreskas and talk about it. So the one I want to focus on right now is the Rivash. You may or may not have heard of him. Is Rabbi Yitzchak ben Sheshes Perfet. I think, Perfet, I'm not sure. This is Spain, it's not French. So he lived from 1326 to 1407. He was the disciple of the Ran. We discussed him at an earlier lecture. He earned his living as a merchant, but he was considered to be, the spiritual leader of the Jewish community of Barcelona. And learned, the Rashbaz, the original, but he is now, who has since passed on, the Ran, and now he is now the head of the Jewish community of Barcelona. He apparently had been arrested actually in the year 1367 with the Ran, with all these trumped up charges, but whatever, they ultimately are released, right, with no harm ultimately done to them. I think he's had enough of Barcelona. He leaves Barcelona, and he actually becomes the Rav in Saragossa. And then from there, he goes to Valencia. I don't know, maybe he wasn't happy with these towns or his positions there, or he felt, that things were, so unpleasant in Spain. So ultimately, he actually leaves. He goes to Algeria and becomes the Rav of Algiers. He, as many, many others, actually starting with the Rambam, with Maimonides, they write different polemics about how one has to be tolerant to returning conversos, those who somehow can escape from the clutches, of those Christians, and want to return to Judaism, and should, under what conditions, should we accept these returning conversos? Are they bona fide Jews? Do they have to go through any process to prove that they're bona fide Jews, etc.? So he wrote about that. He was considered the halachic authority of his time, and we have a lot of his response have come down to us to this day. And actually, from the response, from the Sheilot and Teshuvot, you actually find out a lot about day-to-day life in Spain, and then later in Algiers. By the types of questions people are asking and his responses to them, we said, well, what's troubling the people at that time? What are they concerned about? So it's very interesting. He himself personally was acquainted. I guess he had studied philosophy at a certain point, but he very much opposed Aristotle's approach, and as a result, he would have been opposed to the Rambam, because the Rambam attitude and his philosophical leanings are towards Aristotle. He also opposed the Kabbalah, which would have been the Ramban like Kabbalah. And apparently he maybe to this day he's greatly revered by Algerian Jewry, and they for hundrds of years they would make annual pilgrimages to his burial spot in Algiers. I don't know today, if that's been preserved or existed. I mean, relations today with Morocco are certainly a lot better. I'm not quite sure exactly where we are with Algeria. Okay, now let me talk to you about Rabbi Chisda Kreskas. Okay, he was also a disciple of the Ran. He lived, we don't know his exact date, so these are all circa, which means about. So from 1340 to about 1415. So they're all, pretty much contemporaries. He also was from Barcelona. I told you, and he was one of those who was imprisoned in 1367, and but eventually, was released. And then during those awful riots of 1391, I told you how his son was murdered, and whatever terrible privations in that whole time period. He was a colleague of the Rivash we just talked about, and you often would correspond with him on halakhic matters. So I'm sure some of the she'ilot and teshuvot that have come down were actually perhaps questions that either one of them was posing to the other. He also, took a very active part in general in the Jewish community of Spain, and was a very highly respected individual. He was the head of a yeshiva, but he was mostly famous as being a philosopher and a polemicist. He wrote a book of philosophy called Or Hashem. Again, very much opposed, though, to Aristotelian thought, and as a result, the Rambam for relying on it so much. So obviously, anybody who were at that time period were still adherents of the Rambam's philosophical, works. Obviously, very much opposed to Rabbi Chisda's writings. He had a disciple named Rabbi Yosef Albo. I'll talk a little bit more about him in a little bit, but he defended him. And we know, like down to this day, at the time, obviously, there were many people pro him, but just as equal number against, what he was writing about, Aristotelian philosophy and Rambam's, leaning upon it. But many, many later thinkers, are greatly impacted by his writings. All right. And a lot of the, the Rambam's, modes of thought, they, would have been rejected, right? Obviously by Rabbi Chisda. He also, now this is, I think when I was talking to you about when we had a whole unit on just those people who, that whole opposition, to the Rambam's philosophical writings in general. He was of the thought, as I say, of another Rabbanim of the time period, that the fact that so many people, were defecting, to converting to Christianity, it's because of this reliance on Aristotle's beliefs, like this was harmful. That's why eventually, actually was forbidden to even study philosophy, because they felt, the emphasis should be on the centrality of Judaism and not to waste one's time studying general philosophy. And let's see, he was an advisor to the king at the time. His name was King John. And he was, even though he lived through these difficult, terrible times, he still kept up a relationship with the royal, right? And he did whatever he could to help support and defend, the Jews at that time period. But again, he's famous for a lot of his writings and his defense of Jewry and Judaism. They've come down to us through the ages. Now, when we talk then about, so it's like a 20-year period from 1391, when those awful riots broke out throughout Spain, and then that disputation of Tortosa, which is around the year, goes from 1412 to 1413. The defender on the Jewish side, one of the key rabbanim, is this Rabbi Yosef Albo. So I want to just talk to you a little bit about him and his background. He lived from 1380 to 1444. So he's going more into the 15th century. He's just a young let's just think. So he was born in 1380. Those riots were in 1391. He's just an 11-year-old boy. Look what he had to witness. Again, he was considered, he's the foremost disciple of Rabbi Chistai Kreskas. First, he was a Rav in Daroca, which is apparently a suburb of Saragossa. But then he left and he went to Castile. And again, in 1412, 1413, he was considered one of those key Rabbanim who were the defenders of the Jewish faith, had to give the Jewish position as best could, defending the Talmud at that disputation of Tortosa. I found this so interesting. Okay, so those of you from Rochester. So it says, so he defended the Talmud, who principally against the attacks of the apostate Joshua Lorkey. Do you remember that Lorkey boy? I think Joel was a good friend of his. So I guess I never knew this, but maybe the Lorkeys were Spanish Jews going back. I have to ask Joel. I never got to ask him. In any case, he wrote a book called Sefer HaIkarim, which was as a result of defending the Jewish faith, at this disputation. First of all, just in general, I mean, he was, besides obviously being proficient in his knowledge of Torah and the Talmud, he knew medicine, mathematics, and also philosophy. So he divides his book, this Sefer HaIkarim, this book of principles, into like 3 sections, 3 categories. One is called Ikarim, like the basics, the principles. Then the Shoshim, right? What are the roots? And the Anafim, the branches. And apparently, he had such cogent arguments. It was so well written and expressed that the book soon became apparently very, very popular. And, people who had difficulty, sometimes you don't know what to say. Like even now, how they try to teach kids going to general colleges how to defend their position vis-a-vis Israel, when they have this terrible opposition from all these pro-Palestinian kids at their colleges. So again, this would have been like a seminal work that one would study to know how to defend yourself. And again, he's obviously trying to prove that Judaism is a superior religion, it's pure, and that, but that all religions grow out of a certain basic root source, rather than they branch out and differ afterwards. Okay, so that's all I want to tell you about the Rabbanim up until this time period, and then after that, I will go on actually to the Abarbanel. Okay, we definitely want to study him. All right, so let me just put these pages down for now. Okay, now let's go on. So now what's happening? Okay, so we know we went through the awful riots of 1391. We now know also about this the disputation, in say 1412, 1413, some say a little into 1414. And what's happening now to the Jews of Spain until we talk about the expulsion, obviously, which is in 1492. Now, you have to understand, there is no Inquisition yet. The Inquisition only comes in 1480. All right. So, but believe me, life is not good for the Jews. So let's just talk a little bit, about this. So I want to discuss a bit about the position of the conversos and how very awful and difficult it was for them to survive. Now, some of them obviously did adopt the Catholic faith, and I guess gradually did become sincere adherents to that religion. Obviously, the older generation would always remember that they were once Jews. Also, the general population is not allowing them to forget it. I remember Shalom commented on this. They're called new Christians as opposed to the old, the pure Christians. So it's like maybe even if they now sincerely are trying to follow the tenets of the Catholic faith, but you're always being told that, well, you're the new ones, you're not really quite there. So I just wanted to read you a little bit. And Shalom made a reference to this concept. It's, like showing blood purity. And this is, it's called in Spanish, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, limpieza de sangre. I guess sangria comes from that word. blood, right? Well, sangria is a reddish red drink.
Yeah.
So here's something from it's a quotation, obviously from another source, but the document must have somehow come down. So I guess just talking about somebody trying to clarify what is this blood purity referred to. We declare the so-called conversos, offspring of perverse Jewish ancestors, must be held by law to be infamous and ignominious, unfit and unworthy to hold any public office or any benefice be in the city of Toledo or land within its jurisdiction, or to be commissioners for oaths or notaries, or to have any authority over the true Christians of the Holy Catholic Church. Whoa. So obviously, as sincere as these so-called new Christians were, as much money they probably donated, right, to the church, they're always looked upon with suspicion. And of course, there's definitely that element within these conversos who only outwardly, and I have to understand, they cannot return publicly to being Jews. Even when times seem to get a little better, they can no longer be, because, this is a tenet of the Catholic faith. Once you are baptized, that is it. You are Christian from now and forevermore, and your descendants the same. You cannot go back to whatever your former faith was. In this case, obviously, the Jewish faith. So they're trying to work this balance. Yes, outwardly, they go every Sunday, they go to church. I don't know, they have crosses hanging in their homes, whatever. But secretly, this is, we have a lot of literature comes down to describe this. They're quietly, secretly are trying to practice some semblance of Judaism within their homes. Now, another thing that Shalom pointed out, and I also read, a lot of the conversos continued to live in those same Jewish neighborhoods. So their friends, their relatives, were people who are still outwardly practicing Judaism. So the Catholics, looking upon these Jews now, these conversos, with suspicion, they're saying that's why ultimately they're going to want to expel the Jews, because they're saying they're very detrimental, effect. They're having a very detrimental effect upon the new Christians, because they're reminding them when it's holidays, even when the Sabbath begins, providing them with properly slaughtered meat, So that's why ultimately they're going to turn so much against the Jews and say, well, let's just get rid of them, because these conversos are never going to be true, properly practicing Christians, unless, as I say, we are able somehow to totally remove them from our midst. So now let me just get to where I want to. Make sure I said everything I wanted to about the conversos. Okay, so now what's going to happen? So after the year 1412, 1413, there's going to be a decrease and the people willing to convert to Christianity. Anybody who was already petrified, about, if they would not convert, and that their lives would be taken from them, they've done it. But whatever people at that point had already made the decision that no, they wanted to remain stalwart Jews, they were not going to be converted no matter what, even if you put the sword to them, So there aren't as many, but now we have all these new Christians, mingling around with the old Christians. And even if some of their local neighbors were okay, with it, but the clergy for sure is greatly opposed, to having these conversos, in their mix. And again, they're obviously highly suspicious that the Jews, those who are remaining as Jews, are providing aid and support to these new Christians. And again, Shalom mentioned this, that the new Christians, now that they are no longer Jews, well, now they can engage in commerce and industry and have governmental positions with great impunity. They're Christians just like everybody else. So now there's this rising commercial class, political class, that now are in competition with the Christians who who held a lot of those jobs. And so the animosity is just growing. Obviously the clergy is continuing to preach, weekly in the churches against the Jews, how terrible they are, blah, blah, blah. And it was just really a horrible, horrible situation. Now, from time to time, riots will still be breaking out, but not those huge, widespread riots that occurred in the year 1391. Let me make sure I covered everything I wanted to say here. Apparently in the year 1449, so I don't want you to think that things are 100% peaceful, from 1413 up until, like 1492. Apparently in 1449, there were clashes, very violent ones, in Toledo between these old and new Christians. The new Christians, these conversos have to defend themselves. And many of the homes of these conversos were burned to the ground. A number of them were obviously murdered as well. Just an ugly, life for them. My heart sort of goes out to them that they were forced into doing, even though we could say, oh, it was terrible, they shouldn't have converted. It's not for us to judge. We did not live there at the time. So they're very, I don't have to mention all their names, but there are various different kings, ruling now both in Castile and Aragon. This is before Ferdinand and Isabella. So you have to keep this in mind. All right. Will be in the latter half of the 15th century. The Pope also tried to put a damper on all these attacks on the Jews. And he wanted them, to overturn any negative edicts that were passed. Apparently there were a number of them from 1419 up to 1422. And a lot of those former glorious Jewish communities, really, they're just decimated, at this point. It's really, it was a true tragedy. Again, I told you, I always look in numerous sources, and the statistics differ from every single source. I don't know what's truly accurate. Nobody took population statistics in that time, so it's hard to know. This is one source, and it said that, after those 20 years, of terrible conditions, that in Aragon, the number of Jews went down to just 6,000 families. So I think I had discussed this 2 lessons ago. I feel there must have been in Spain, including conversos, at least 250,000 Jews. It's unclear. So many of them are obviously being murdered, over that past century. A lot. Should we include the conversos as being Jews? It's a little hard. And then also there's a dispute in number. Well, how many actually opted to remain as Jews and be expelled from the country? It seems to me, because I've seen numbers going from 100,000, 200,000, all the way up to 600,000. So I feel compromised. We say about 250,000, might be more accurate figure. Probably 30,000 Jews lived in Castile, I suppose. So you see, not as many anymore in Aragon, even though Barcelona at one point was this thriving Jewish community. But more living in Castile. Again, not in those main centers anymore, like Seville and Toledo. So many Jews were murdered there. But there are lots of other smaller towns throughout Spain. So apparently a lot of them went to live there. And let me just say, so obviously, there were these edicts against the Jews. Some places they were enforced, sometimes lesser enforced. I saw, showed you how the Pope at one point trying to overturn them. But, the local populace, they're such filled now with hatred against the Jews. And don't forget, when you're murdering all these Jews, well, what's happening to their property? So it becomes confiscated. It goes to the local people, or it's going to the clergy. I just want to let you know that. So during this time period, there was actually one Jew who rose to a higher position. His name was Don Abraham Bienveniste, and he apparently was the royal treasurer in Castile. All right. Now I want to explain to you about Ferdinand and Isabella. So there were kings prior to their going to these positions. I think this is interesting. I think you might like to know a little bit more, especially about Isabella's background. So there was 1465, there was a Henry IV. He's then deposed, as the king of Castile. His brother Alfonso takes his place. Then there's that civil war breaks out in 1467. A lot of damage to the Jewish section. Not that the Jews were necessarily involved or taking sides, but unfortunately suffer as a result. Alfonso tries to put everything down, but he dies in 1468. Now we're going to come to Isabel. She was a younger sister. So actually those last three rulers that I talked about, they're all siblings. It's not like they're sons or daughters of a prior king. They're all siblings. I guess I had seniority to whatever children those other men might have had. And so that year, 1468, she becomes the Queen of Castile. So now she is very marketable, all right, because Castile is a huge territory in this Spanish, landscape. So a wedding is then arranged in 1469 with Ferdinand. At this point, Ferdinand is the Prince of Aragon. He is not the King of Aragon. But in 1479, he becomes the king. Now Castile and Aragon are united, and they are a formidable Christian force. And now that's when they're going to start their campaign against the last vestiges of, Muslim rule. Remember, I told you that's a southeastern part of Spain called Granada. But of course, part and parcel with getting rid of the Muslims, the Moors, they were also then, put a lot of energy into somehow dealing with their Jewish question, because they want to make the entire country of Spain completely Catholic. It appears again from various readings that Isabella was the one who was the most Catholic of the two, she and her husband. He obviously didn't put up too much of a fuss. I think he seemed to have had a better relation with certain Jews, but obviously in the end he gives up, lets her do what she wants, and so she's the primary mover with the installation of the Inquisition, and then obviously with the expulsion of the Jews. I want to turn just for a moment. We will learn that, and you might have seen the famous painting of two individuals who go to plead the case of the Jews before Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492, that the Jews should not all be expelled. And the two key people in the painting are Abraham Senor and Don Yitzhak Abarbanel. Now I want to discuss Abarbanel separately because he's considered to be mostly a Portuguese Jew, although obviously at this latter time period of Spanish Jewish history, he had moved to Spain. But let me tell you a little bit about Abraham Senor and how he rose. Because by the time 1492, he's an 80-year-old man. So the bulk of his life has obviously taken place prior to that. He was a very scholarly, he was a talented, he was an extremely wealthy Jew. And under former kings, prior to Isabella's, becoming the queen, he was involved with a lot of the tax collecting on behalf of was Henry, the king. In the 1470s, he was appointed chief rabbi and supreme judge for the entire Jewish population of Castile. But he's a very complicated individual, and he often served various masters here. He appears to be serving the Jewish community as their chief representative. On the other hand, he has a very important financial role, within the monarchy. So, kind of betwixt and between. And up until 1492, when that edict of expulsion, will go into force, he always made the attempt in prior years to always mitigate any evil decrees that would have been declared against the Jews in Spain. As the Inquisition grew in power, he was definitely a spokesperson, talking against it. And he knew, obviously, especially Isabella, she's a real zealot for the Catholic faith. He somehow tries to tamper some of that and to protect the Jews for who he feels responsible for. But, in the end, this is really a sad situation. I'm telling you, this man was 80 years old. But when it came to 1492, and he was given the choice, obviously, to be expelled, to be still identified as a Jew, and to leave Spain, he opts to convert to Christianity. So I don't know whatever happened ultimately to his family, what they ever did, but it's just really, really sad. I talk a little bit more now about the Inquisition and how it came to be. The Inquisition actually was established in the year 1233. That's how long back, centuries prior to 1492, it existed. And of course, it was established by the Catholic Church as a means to root out heresy. And it was against, other Christians who had, divergent opinions of how Christianity, should be interpreted. So it was around, you could see, for over, 250 years prior to its being, coming to full ugly force, right, in Spain. Now, all along, obviously, you could see how the Christians of Spain, how they're working so hard to convert the Jews to their view, the one true church of Christianity. But the Inquisition is somewhat different, and its methods are different. It was a very fearful institution. And while it had always existed, I told you now, you can see for over 250 years, at this point, it starts in actually 1478, although it won't be entrenched more to 1480, 1481. They weren't established as, so to speak, an official arm of the church in Spain. But it's also combined with the political power of the state. It has the backing of the state. And I think that the combo of those two, the church and state, maybe that's by the time we come to, democratic institution, we make this very firm distinction between the two, because the two in conjunction can, wreak terrible havoc, which is what is about to happen. First of all, their investigations are always done in secret. You never knew. So I'm trying to imagine, again, what it felt like for these conversos. Because anybody could, whether you actually were properly, living your life as a good Catholic, but anybody who was a new, they were all under suspicion. It was, I remember thinking in the Soviet Union, they did the same thing, how people would denounce one another, that, they saw something wrong in the kitchen, or the drapes were drawn, or there wasn't any smoke coming out of the chimney on the Sabbath, and, so just a constant state of fear, and they would walk around in their black robes, with their big crosses. They must have been really very scary people. They had complete independence to do their work. Okay. And I told you, obviously the state gave their sanction and backing to whatever they were doing. That's what they were sort of, they were like an independent body. And they all became a very wealthy institution, because if somebody was found guilty of heresy, particularly the Jews, against, the Catholic faith, and then they, would have been tortured and then burned at the stake, their property reverted to the Inquisition. They became very wealthy. Now, eventually, obviously, some of that property, I think that's why maybe that's why Ferdinand finally agrees to Isabella, some of that property, a portion of it will also go then go into the coffers of the state, and that's why they're giving their sanction to it. Oh gosh. So, as I said, there's this awful climate of fear. There's a lot of animosity against Jews, that's very pervasive in this Catholic country. Everyone is suspicious of one another, afraid of the competition, afraid of the power, of the wealth, that belongs to the Jews. It's just an awful, awful time period. So I told you, so Ferdinand and Isabella, they will now, again, they've been married now about 10 years, but now they're finally, they're both a king and a queen. They will unify the country, right? And now they're going to try to get rid of, all non-Catholics from their land. And apparently, and I told you, it was officially instituted in the year 1478 because the Pope finally, sent out a bull, like authorizing that the Inquisition, could set up, be established within Spain. But their chief purpose, not to look for heretics in the Christian faith per se, but to hunt down those new Christians, those conversos, and are they, really properly practicing Christianity? Have they totally left their Jewish roots? Already, I would say, I'm trying to determine when eventually these new Christians are going to be called by a very derisive name, the Marranos. Marranos means pigs. And it comes, I believe that very, negative connotation came out already maybe in the 1460s, 1470s. It wasn't just as a result of the Inquisition. Already, a lot of those new Christians, the Jew, former Jews are being called by that. But now with the combination, all right, of the backing of the state, so there's a lot of wealth backing the tactics of the Inquisition. They, I presume you have read or, how the Inquisition would, first you would be called upon, that you're under suspicion. So I can imagine the climate of fear that must have been in these new, the conversos' homes during this whole thing, if you had like maybe a span of 40, 60 days that you could actually admit, right, to having practiced Judaism secretly. And if not, that's when they started torturing you and rack, all those other ugly things. Actually, when I was in England, this was like years ago, nothing but shalom, on my way back from Israel in 1967, the summer. So I went to the Tower of London, and they have all these instruments of torture there. And there's one thing there that's called the Spanish boot. It's really horrible. It was like this high boot, and in it had these metal spikes. And when you would close it, it would dig into the person's skin, God knows. So I don't know. I guess people want to look for ugly instruments of torture. You can find them in every land. Let's see what else. Okay, so then by 1480, it's now, again, the Inquisition is first allowed to set up shop, so to speak, in 1478, but it takes a while to get yourself organized, hire people, et cetera, et cetera. So by September 1480, it's like really set up. The first auto de fe, in which, these conversos were, obviously adjudicated that they were guilty. That occurs in 1481. And I believe, I'm trying to remember, there were many, many, many families that were caught up in this. One of them was actually Louis Centennial, who was actually also had a prominent position in the Spanish government, but not he himself, but members of his family are convicted of being, these renegade, Jews and to be put to death. And, it was like this, again, I presume you've read some books about this, it was like this huge public spectacle and like this big square of the city, wherever it starts off in Seville, then spreads to other cities. And you would be led out wearing this let me make sure I get the word right. I saw it someplace. San Benito. Okay. Apparently this is some sort of special cloak. I saw in one place it was yellow. It had a huge cross in the front. Either it was hooded or you had to wear a special hat that also had the cross on it. And then at the last moment before they actually set fire, to the straw that was at your feet. And first of all, you were tied to the stake. You were given the option, and at that point you're guilty, but if you want to, admit your guilt and, so to speak, then be accepted back, into the arms of Christ. So then they would garrote you, like the mafia, so you would, in other words, die instantly, as opposed to the fact you're going to be burned at the stake, which must have been the most horrible, painful, thing. So, and then as I say, so from 1481 on, and this is going to recur intermittently. That's the tactic of the Inquisition. And the Inquisition, is not just in Spain. It is not just in Portugal. It comes all the way to the New World, to all of South America, including Mexico, because these are all will be countries that will be established by Spaniards or Portuguese people, and they bring that ugly, ugly Inquisition with them. Let me see, they actually were auto de fe in Mexico City and in Lima, Peru. There might be other places, but those two are the most famous ones that I'm aware of. Then in 1483, the infamous Thomas de Torquemada, he is made the chief inquisitor. Okay, so obviously there was somebody else who had been acting in that position. Maybe they didn't feel he was ruthless enough. And also he's like the chief, priest who ministers to Isabella. So maybe she's obviously responsible for raising him to this position. He is now the chief inquisitor. So at this point, I think they've already made up their mind. Obviously, first they have to get rid of the Moors. That's a big military campaign. That doesn't happen until January 1492, when they will finally be victorious and take over the Alhambra. And look at within 2 months, they're going to call for their edict of expulsion. It's not enough just to get rid of these Muslim Moors, right? We also want to get rid of those Jews. We want to make our entire country a pure Catholic country. So again, it was early January that they are successful, right? In that Battle of Granada, it all becomes under the control now of the entire country of Spain. The northern part is still not, that's Navarre, right? But the bulk of the country is under the control of Ferdinand and Isabella. Again, and you can imagine, where was the money coming from for the military force that was victorious in Granada? It came from these wealthy Jews, like that Abraham Senior and Abarbanel, and then in 2 months they turn against them and say, well, we're expelling all of you Jews. We got as much money from you as we wanted, and now we're getting rid of you. Really, very, very sad. So I think, let's do a little bit more, and then we'll continue the rest to the very end, and then I'll expand a bit more about the Jews of Portugal next time, and I especially want to tell you a lot about Abarbanel. That an edict goes out on March 30th. They have literally 4 months to sell off most of their possessions, and they can take very, very little with them when they leave Spain, and people take advantage of them. It was really awful. And within 4 months, they are forced to leave the country by any means possible. And so again, I think I'll expand upon that a little bit more next time we get together. Let me wish all of you a Chasher v'Sameach. Have a most wonderful, wonderful Yontif with your family. Hopefully, most of you will be with family. And should just all be good. And the weather up north should continue to stay mild, I hope. So I'm heading in that direction. And down here in Florida, hopefully it won't be as hot as it has been. I think tomorrow's supposed to go up to 88 degrees here, but then it's dropping to still very warm, but a more comfortable, like 79 up to 82. That's sort of in general the temperatures this time of the year, and still not that terrible humidity of the summer. That usually starts sometime in May. All right. So again, great seeing all of you. Again, be well, stay healthy, and again, have the most wonderful Chag Kasher V'Sameach.
Chag Kasher
Thank you.
V'Sameach.
Chag Kasher V'Sameach.
My pleasure. Bye-bye, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
Take care.
You too, Malka. Have a Chag Kasher
I
V'Sameach.
appreciate it. Have a good Yom Tov. Bye-bye.